I've met so many artists at conventions that show me their work, and it's always great meeting new artists at shows, and they're really eager to show off their stuff, and basically to learn. I like to think it keeps me learning as well. So, you know what I'm saying? If you can't teach someone something, it's like you didn't really know it that well to begin with. And I remember one artist in particular who had really good figure drawing skills, very tight renders, but like so many artists trying to break into comics or illustration, they had some pretty weak backgrounds. I get it. So much of our instincts as humans is to focus on the person, the figure, the character. I mean, it's a biological imperative, right? We train on figure drawing, we observe people, we draw out in the public, details, costumes. But that can be kind of a trap just to focus on the characters. You want to get your costumes right, you want to get the elements of anatomy that are exciting right. But everything has anatomy. And that's what I tried to teach this one artist about buildings and scenes. A scene, an establishing shot, whatever you want to call it, any actual place in the world has a layout. Civil engineers do all their surveying, and architects have different terms like an exposure or a site plan. Filmmakers and directors refer to things like staging, stagecraft. That's probably the easiest way for many artists to think about some of these things as it comes from, a related artistic field. But look really close at a map of any place, and what do you see? Think about a place where any good number of humans live and what their relationship to raw geography of that place really is, and you start to get the idea of how deep this can go. When all you want to do is make a cool looking frame for your comic or illustrations or just a cool looking background. You can make this easy on yourself. When I was talking to this one young man, I took a panel that he had done of a hero flying or jumping from a tall building. And like a lot of artists, the default cheat was something he used just to get the job done. He drew a large box in perspective. He drew a grid on it, and on each of those faces of the grid, he had a succession of smaller nested boxes, each repeating, trying to indicate windows or some other architecture. I think he may have had a spire at the top of the building, a little underwhelming. It was not especially convincing. It was effective. You knew it was a building and it was sitting back there. And to many who would be more impressed with his figure drawing, like I said, it was, he had stronger figure drawing skills. Something like this could be perfectly adequate. But you dive deeper and you dive more professionally into it, it would have been greatly improved by thinking of the building a bit more. I once had to 3D model a 1930s accurate scale model of the Empire State Building, right down to the last window, from bottom floor to the mooring mast at the top. Well, if you don't know what that is, it's this little thing at the top of the building that they actually intended at one point to have blimps anchored there. Now you just see a massive antennas and other technology up there. If you saw King Kong, anyway, I brought it up to show that the Empire State Building has a clear set of structures that build from one to another. A ground floor of shops and glass windows and high columns and doors with a symmetry across its longest side. This floor alone would have made a unique modern building. But there's a next tier and another tier and another tier. The next tier rises with offset boxes to a bit of like a third of its actual height or its total height. And when seen in combination with the ground floor, you get the impression of real solidity. A tower with a box with some offset spaces and a really solid base. But then the building ascends and narrows, gaining most of its record breaking height at the time, and still gives every floor a near equal number of windows. That acceleration slows again as it inserts other forms, rises a short distance until it peaks, and shows off its crown. It's the observation deck, the tower, and the cupola. That's the space capsule bit at the very top of the raw design. Taken together and translated into, something a comic anatomy artist is going to understand, you have the building's feet, its shoulders, the neck, and the head. I've always loved the Empire State Building as an example of this, and many Marvel artists and DC artists as well have depicted it over the years. And usually they're using photo reference, but the ones that don't understand this shape and anatomy and language. And it's a great example for artists who want to practice drawing basic architecture. You have to pick your battles with this kind of building. I modeled all of them in 3D, and even that took a while. But thinking of a building as having a broad footing, a real stance, and presence in your work can really bring out a lot. The Empire State Building sits in a really busy set of boxes and other streets and lower level forms, and actually stuff you might be more familiar with, the common taxis, street signs, mailboxes, etc. If you've seen a picture of New York around that set of streets, you know it's the Big Apple once you see it. I learned perspective drawing in a pretty technical format. Draw the plan view or your top down view. Align your elevations, basically the sides of the building. Plot your vanishing points and points of perspective, and then derive your drawing from that diagram. It's bloody time consuming. Artists take a lot of shortcuts to drawing perspective, kind of based on that method, but not entirely a slave to it. However, time honored, it's also really consuming. And our digital CAD methods are so much faster and accurate, it really feels antiquated. But I learned it, I suffered through it. And I'm glad I did because it helped me approach all of my backgrounds with real technical knowledge. But that young man at the convention said the things so many artists say about drawing backgrounds. Just need to practice them. And then it becomes obvious in portfolio pieces that they show. Today, you might be able to get away with an art career that only focuses on figures. People like Loish, Artgerm, everyone and their brother is going to bark, just use AI or something similar, or just use CG. And that might work just fine if their figure work is equal to that level of quality, or at least equal to that level of AI or CG. But for those who still want to work on this, I can tell you the thing that made me love backgrounds. Just going someplace I love, an actual physical place, and drawing spaces with no people in them, plein air drawing. I used to go to Disneyland nearly every other week when I had those old annual passes when you could do that. No reservations. I had the top annual pass. On any day of the year, I could drive down there, just spend the afternoon drawing. I have a sketchbook nearly filled with just drawn spaces from around Disneyland and California Adventure. For me, this was not just practice drawing backgrounds and spaces, it was really learning to love that kind of work. How many of us go to places and spaces as artists and just admire the space? I used to go to this coffee shop just about every month to meet with other comic book artists and writers and creatives. And I never really drew at those meetings. They were called coffee and comics, and people would bring their sketchbooks and other things and draw whatever they wanted or draw whatever comic they were working on, something work in progress. But towards the end of our meetings, we don't meet anymore since COVID. Towards the end of those meetings, I was just drawing the place. It had this kitschy kind of charm. It was a converted home, after all. Someone whose work I read, a Stoicism author of some repute, Ryan Holiday, says that to do anything that is hard, you have to try and love the process. I could tell that this young guy at the convention had some issues finding the same love for backgrounds as he did for figures in action. You gotta love the whole scene, after all. Working in animation and visual effects, there's a subset of this field called set extension, where you have to repair, replace, augment, or otherwise fabricate a digital version of the background. One of my absolute favorite jobs doing this kind of work was for the short-lived David Duchovny show, Aquarius. It was set in the Charles Manson era of Los Angeles in the 60s, and one of the recurring tasks on the show was taking current day aerial footage of Los Angeles and getting it close, maybe not totally precise, but close to that period in appearance. What that involved was removing cell phone towers, obviously modern buildings, and sometimes giving current buildings a facelift back to their former selves. As the saying goes, I was really happier than a pig in you know what. But while this work is entirely digital, I definitely dove deeper into what makes any scene, even my own drawings, seem credible. One of the most enjoyable tasks I had was restoring the facade of the old Times building in LA. And if you're familiar with its current state, it suffered some of the same architectural trends and business demands over the years with different additions and alterations that cover its former glory and, in my mind, purity. I got to restore a detailed version in one matte painting and a smaller aerial view of that building digitally. by hand with no 3D modeling. It is as close as I've ever felt to the work some of my heroes in matte painting have done over the years, people like Peter Ellenshaw and others. You can see how layers of time have changed that building. Offices and spaces were added like pods across its structure, hiding some of the classic Art Deco details and the original window dressings. Where's the anatomy of it all? If you want a really quick exercise, try this. Make a list in 30 seconds of the anatomy of an airplane, a car, a road, or a mountain. Those things added together could make a seriously fun action scene. See you next time.